The morning I found dead fish floating belly up in my lake, I had no idea I was about to take down an entire HOA board and cost them $500,000. Let me paint you a picture. I'm Rex Crawford, spent 30 years busting my ass as a machinist, saving every penny for 15 acres of retirement paradise. Crystal clear, spring-fed lake, perfect for fishing away from the world's bullshit. Then I wake up to what looks like a crime scene. Dozens of bass and bluegill floating belly up like they just gave up on life. The chemical stench hit me like a slap, sharp, toxic, the kind that makes you gag and stumble backward. An oily rainbow slick spread across water so clear you used to see bottom at 10 feet. My trail camera caught everything. HOA maintenance truck dumping barrels at 3 a.m. By the time I was done, their board president was in federal prison and I had an entire community begging for forgiveness. But that's getting ahead of myself. What would you do if you caught your HOA poisoning your property? Where are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. Let me back up and tell you how I got here. After 30 years running a lathe at Midwest Manufacturing, my hands were shot, my back was screaming, and my 401k finally had enough zeros to make me smile. I wasn't looking for trouble, just wanted 15 acres where nobody could tell me what to do. Found this perfect slice of heaven 40 minutes outside town. Natural spring-fed lake, dense woods, and enough space to build a modest cabin with my own two hands. The realtor mentioned it bordered some fancy HOA community called Willowbrook Estates. But hell, their McMansions were 200 yards away. What could go wrong? Famous last words, right? Everything was perfect for exactly 18 months. I'd wake up to loons calling across water so still it looked like black glass. The smell of pine sap mixed with that clean mineral scent of spring water. My cabin wasn't much. 1,200 square feet of honest lumber and sweat equity, but every board was level, every joint was tight, and it was mine. Then I met Constance Fitzgerald. Picture your worst nightmare of suburban royalty, then add a law degree and enough entitlement to power a small city. 52 years old, real estate attorney's wife, drives a white BMW that's always spotless like she has servants with detailing brushes. Always dressed in tennis whites or designer athleisure that probably costs more than my truck payment. She showed up at my door on a Tuesday morning, clicking across my gravel driveway in heels that had no business being within a mile of actual dirt. "Mr. Crawford, I'm Constance Fitzgerald, HOA board president." Her voice had that practiced tone rich people use when they're explaining why you don't belong. "We need to discuss your situation." I wiped sawdust off my hands, been building new kitchen cabinets, and stepped onto my porch. "Ma'am, this isn't HOA property." "Technically, no." She glanced at her clipboard like it contained state secrets. "But your structures are visible from our community. Our residents invested in a certain lifestyle, and frankly..." She paused, studying my work clothes with the kind of look you'd give roadkill. "This area is meant for people of certain standards." The way she said certain standards while looking me up and down made my jaw clench. 30 years of honest work, and this woman's talking to me like I crawled out of a swamp. "Lady, everything's built to code. County inspector, I'm sure you did your best with your background." Another pause, another look. "Perhaps you'd consider relocating somewhere more suitable?" After she left, I should have known I was in for a war. But I figured she'd made her point and would buzz off to terrorize someone else. Wrong again. First came the anonymous complaints. Fire hazard, unsightly structures, health code violations. I'd lose a day each time some county inspector showed up, found nothing wrong, and left shaking his head. The crunch of their tires on my gravel became my new least favorite sound. Then Constance escalated. HOA landscaping crews started parking equipment right on my property line. Diesel trucks idling at dawn, exhaust fumes mixing with morning mist off the lake. The foreman would smile and wave like we were old friends while turning my sunrise coffee into a diesel breakfast. The real gut punch came when they accidentally sprayed herbicide on my vegetable garden. 20 years growing tomatoes in that spot. Watched them blacken and curl like they'd been torched, the acrid chemical smell lingering for days. "Wind must have carried it," the supervisor shrugged. "These things happen. Sure, wind that blows in perfect rectangles matching my garden boundaries. Must be that new GPS-guided weather system." That's when I started documenting everything. Trail camera pointed at the lake. Logbook of every HOA vehicle. Photos time-stamped and filed. 30 years in manufacturing teaches you that when things start failing this systematically, somebody's sabotaging the system. Good thing I was watching. Because what Constance did next turned my quiet retirement into a federal crime scene. 3 weeks later, my trail camera caught something that made my blood boil. 2:30 in the morning, clear as day under infrared, HOA maintenance truck backing up to my lake. Two guys in coveralls hauling industrial barrels to the water's edge, dumping contents that glowed white-hot on camera, then speeding off like they just robbed a bank. By sunrise, 47 fish were floating belly up. Bass, bluegill, even the old catfish I'd been trying to catch for 2 years. The water looked like someone had poured motor oil across the surface. And the smell, Christ, that chemical stench burned your throat from 50 yards away. My boots squelched in the muddy shoreline as I collected samples, trying not to gag. I saved that footage to 3 different drives, printed screenshots, and marched straight to the monthly HOA meeting that Thursday night. Willowbrook's community center smelled like fresh carpet and disappointment. The room was packed with residents who looked like they'd stepped out of a country club catalog. Constance sat at the head table in a cream-colored blazer, running the meeting like she was chairing the Supreme Court. "Mr. Crawford," she announced when I stood up during open comments, "you're not a resident. This meeting is for Willowbrook homeowners only." "Well, Constance, since your people poisoned my lake, I figure that makes it my business." I held up my printouts. Got it all on camera. The room went dead quiet. You could hear the air conditioning humming and someone's nervous throat clearing in the back row. Here's where Constance showed her true colors. Instead of looking shocked or apologetic, she leaned back in her chair with this smug little smile that made my fists clench. "That's a very serious accusation, Mr. Crawford. Are you suggesting our maintenance staff would deliberately contaminate your property?" She paused for effect, then delivered the gut punch. "Because that sounds like insurance fraud to me." "Insurance fraud? Oh, yes." She shuffled through some papers like she'd been expecting this conversation for weeks. "I have witness statements from 3 residents who saw you dumping containers near the lake last week. Isn't it convenient that you suddenly have a contamination problem right after your property taxes went up?" The room started buzzing with whispers. I felt heat creeping up my neck as Constance produced typed statements claiming I'd been seen dumping chemicals myself. 3 signatures, 3 lies, all neat and tidy on HOA letterhead. This woman had prepared for my accusation by fabricating counter-evidence. The sheer balls of it left me speechless for about 10 seconds. "Furthermore," Constance continued, savoring her moment, "given your hostile behavior and these fraudulent claims, the board votes to ban you from future meetings as a disruptive non-resident. All in favor?" 5 hands shot up immediately, like they'd rehearsed this little performance. But here's the thing about being a machinist for 30 years. You learn to think 3 moves ahead while everyone else is still figuring out move 1. While Constance was orchestrating her kangaroo court, I was quietly photographing those witness statements with my phone. Amazing how much people leave lying around when they think they've won. After the meeting, I lingered in the parking lot until most residents had left, breathing in the cool night air and planning my next move. Constance always parked closest to the building. God forbid she walk an extra 20 feet in those designer heels. While she was inside, probably celebrating her victory with the remaining board members, I slipped back into the community center through the side door that someone had propped open for loading supplies. The conference room was empty, chairs stacked against the walls, but Constance had left her precious file folder on the table. Inside, copies of HOA waste disposal contracts, vendor agreements, and, jackpot, invoices showing they'd been illegally dumping cleaning solvents for 6 months to save disposal fees. Apparently saving a few $1,000s was worth risking federal environmental violations. I photographed everything with my phone, hands steady despite my racing heart, put the folder back exactly where I found it, and walked out whistling an old Merle Haggard tune. Next morning, I drove to the county environmental lab with water samples in mason jars and my camera footage on a flash drive. Cost me $400 out of pocket, but the results were worth every penny. Methylene chloride and trichloroethylene in concentrations that could drop a grizzly bear. Then I did something Constance never expected from a simple machinist. I'd read somewhere that EPA complaints were free to file online, and they had to investigate within 30 days if the contamination affected waterways. Since my spring-fed lake connected to protected wetlands downstream, this was about to become Uncle Sam's problem. The complaint form took 20 minutes to fill out. I attached my photos, lab results, and camera footage, hit submit, and got an automatic confirmation with a case number. 3 days later, my phone rang. "Mr. Crawford, this is Agent Torres with the EPA Criminal Investigation Division. We need to talk." Agent Torres turned it out to be a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who'd been investigating environmental crimes longer than I'd been fishing. We met at a diner outside town where the coffee tasted like motor oil and the vinyl booths had seen better decades. She spread my photos across the sticky Formica table like she was dealing cards in a high-stakes poker game. "Mr. Crawford, what you've documented here constitutes multiple felony violations of the Clean Water Act. We're talking $50,000 per day per violation." She tapped one of my infrared photos with a chipped fingernail. This isn't some HOA dispute anymore. This is federal environmental crime. I was still processing that bombshell when Constance launched her counterattack. A thick envelope arrived in my mailbox 3 days later. Certified mail from Fitzgerald and Associates, attorney at law. The paper was so expensive it practically crinkled with arrogance. Inside was a cease and desist letter demanding $50,000 for defamation and intentional interference with business relationships. The legal language was dense enough to choke a Supreme Court justice, but the message was crystal clear. Shut up or pay up. That same week, Constance filed for a restraining order claiming I'd threatened violence at the HOA meeting. According to her sworn statement, I'd made aggressive gestures and used intimidating language that made board members fear for their safety. Complete fabrication, but realistic enough that I had to take a day off to appear in court and explain to a skeptical judge why I wasn't actually a dangerous lunatic. Then things got weird. I noticed a guy in a wrinkled sedan parked across from my property, taking pictures with a telephoto lens. When I walked over to say hello, he didn't even try to hide what he was doing. "You Rex Crawford?" He was maybe 60, built like a retired cop, with the kind of mustache that went out of style during the Carter administration. Depends who's asking. "Name's Patterson, private investigator." He handed me a business card that looked like it came from a gas station vending machine. "Lady's paying me good money to document your activities, but between you and me, this whole thing stinks worse than week-old fish." Here's where the mini twist hit me like a slap. Patterson wasn't just following me. Constance had asked him to plant evidence. "She wanted me to dump some chemical containers near your lake," he said, scratching his mustache nervously. "Make it look like you'd been disposing of solvents yourself, offered me an extra $5,000 to doctor some photos." He shook his head. 30 years in this business, and I ain't starting to frame people now. That ain't worth my license or my conscience." Meanwhile, my neighbor Dolores shuffled over with news that made my blood pressure spike. Sweet 83-year-old lady who'd been bringing me garden tomatoes since I moved in. Turns out Constance had made her an interesting offer. "Rex, honey, that awful woman came by yesterday with a briefcase full of cash." Dolores clutched her sweater like it was armor. $5,000 to sign a paper saying I'd seen you dumping chemicals at night. Said it would help protect the community from dangerous elements. What did you tell her? I told her to take her dirty money and shove it where the sun don't shine. Dolores might have been a church-going grandmother, but she had steel in her spine. That woman's been terrorizing this neighborhood for years. High time someone stood up to her. The pattern was becoming clear. Constance wasn't just fighting dirty. She was committing fresh crimes to cover up the old ones. Witness tampering, attempted evidence planting, perjury, and sworn court documents. Each desperate move just dug her hole deeper. But here's my counterpunch. While Constance was busy hiring lawyers and private investigators, I was quietly building my federal case. I called Agent Torres with updates on every harassment attempt, creating a documented pattern of obstruction. Then I filed my second EPA complaint, this one specifically targeting the ongoing violations and including the waste disposal contracts I'd photographed. I'd been reading up on environmental law. Turns out whistleblowers get special federal protection, and attempting to intimidate them carries serious prison time. Every legal threat Constance sent wasn't just failing to silence me. It was creating additional evidence of criminal conspiracy. Agent Torres called with an update that made my week. Mr. Crawford, we've discovered your HOA has been falsifying environmental compliance reports for 3 years. We're looking at systemic fraud now, and Mrs. Fitzgerald's obstruction attempts just upgraded this to organized criminal activity. The irony was beautiful. Constance thought she was playing small-town politics, pulling strings with her husband's law firm connections and country club influence. But I'd escalated this to federal court, where her tennis bracelet meant exactly nothing to EPA criminal investigators who'd seen this playbook before. She was bringing a gavel to a gunfight, and she didn't even know it yet. The best part? Every desperate move she made just gave federal prosecutors more ammunition. Her fancy law degree was about to get schooled by the Clean Water Act. 3 weeks later, I woke up to the sound of rushing water where there shouldn't have been any. My basement workshop was flooded with 2 inches of murky water that smelled like wet concrete and ruined dreams. Someone had cut my main water line during the night with surgical precision, clean sliced through PVC pipe that no reasonable person would call accidental. The insurance adjuster was a weathered guy named Frank who'd been investigating suspicious claims since before I learned to drive. He squatted next to the severed pipe, running his fingers along the cut marks like he was reading Braille. In 23 years, I've never seen a pipe cut this clean by accident, he said, pulling out a magnifying glass that looked older than my truck. These are tool marks, Rex, professional plumbing cutters, probably Klein or Rigid brand. This was sabotage. The timing wasn't coincidental. 2 days earlier, I'd found my truck tires slashed while parked outside Henderson's Hardware. 4 perfectly punctured sidewalls that cost me $600 to replace. The store's security footage showed an HOA maintenance truck lurking in the background, though conveniently, the license plate was obscured by mud. But Constance wasn't done playing games. She filed a complaint with the state environmental agency claiming my septic system was polluting groundwater. The inspector who showed up was a tired-looking bureaucrat who seemed annoyed to be there. Someone called in an anonymous tip with your exact address, he explained, checking boxes on his clipboard. Said there was raw sewage seeping into the water table. He looked around my property, which was obviously well-maintained, and sighed. Anonymous tips are usually bullshit, but we have to investigate everyone. My septic system passed inspection with flying colors. I'd had it professionally maintained every 3 years like clockwork. But the real kicker came when I researched Constance's latest legal maneuver. The HOA was attempting to claim adverse possession of a 10-foot strip of my property that included lake access. Adverse possession. Basically legal theft if you can prove you've been using someone else's land openly for a certain period. Except I'd been living on my property for 18 months, documenting every interaction, and adverse possession requires decades of continuous use in most states. Constance's legal team either didn't do their homework or was betting I wouldn't fight back. Wrong on both counts. The mini-twist came when my research revealed something interesting. 3 other property owners bordering Willowbrook had received identical adverse possession claims in the past 5 years. All had quietly settled rather than fight expensive legal battles. Constance wasn't just targeting me. She was running a systematic land grab operation using HOA resources and intimidation tactics. Here's where being a methodical machinist paid off. I'd been documenting everything since day one. Photographs, timestamps, GPS coordinates. I had security footage showing exactly when and where HOA vehicles had trespassed on my property. Their adverse possession claim was built on quicksand, and I had the evidence to prove it. My counterpunch started with a phone call to Sarah Chen, an investigative journalist at the regional newspaper who specialized in municipal corruption. I'd read her series on county commissioner kickbacks and figured she might be interested in HOA fraud. Rex, if half of what you're telling me is true, this is front-page material, she said after I emailed her my documentation. I've been getting tips about Willowbrook for months, but nobody would go on record. You willing to be interviewed? While Sarah started digging into HOA financial records through Freedom of Information Act requests, I launched a GoFundMe campaign for legal defense. I figured maybe a few neighbors might chip in $20. Instead, the fund raised $12,000 in 48 hours. Turns out plenty of people had been screwed by HOAs and were eager to support someone fighting back. The comments section read like a therapy session for suburban oppression. They fined me $500 for hanging laundry outside. HOA sued me for planting vegetables instead of flowers. Board president embezzled dues for 3 years and got away with it. I wasn't just fighting Constance anymore. I was representing everyone who'd ever been bullied by petty suburban dictators with clipboards and god complexes. Agent Torres called with an update that made my day. Mr. Crawford, Mrs. Fitzgerald's obstruction attempts have elevated this case significantly. We're now investigating organized criminal activity under RICO statutes. Her husband's law firm is also under scrutiny for potential conspiracy charges. The irony was perfect. Every attempt to silence me just created more federal evidence. Every lawsuit, every fake complaint, every intimidation tactic was documented and forwarded to investigators who specialized in exactly this kind of corruption. Constance thought she was playing chess while I was playing checkers, but I wasn't playing games at all. I was building a federal case that would end her reign of suburban terror permanently. The best part? She still had no idea how deep the hole she dug really was. But the EPA was about to show her the bottom. Sarah Chen's investigation hit pay dirt 3 weeks later. She'd been digging through HOA financial records obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests. Turns out HOA budgets are public documents in most states, something Constance apparently forgot during her reign of suburban terror. Rex, you need to sit down for this, Sarah said when she called. I could hear papers rustling in the background and the click of computer keys. You didn't just catch them dumping chemicals, you caught them stealing. The bombshell? Constance had embezzled $180,000 from the HOA reserve fund over 3 years. The money had been laundered through fake landscaping contracts with her brother's company, complete with invoices for services never performed and materials never delivered. Get this, Sarah continued, barely containing her excitement. The chemical dumping started exactly when legitimate disposal costs would have exceeded the stolen funds. She couldn't afford proper hazardous waste disposal because she'd already spent the money on herself. The paper trail was damning. Constance had been billing the HOA for premium landscape maintenance at twice the market rate, with payments going to Fitzgerald Outdoor Solutions, a shell company owned by her brother Marcus, who lived in Florida and had never set foot in our county. But the real kicker came from Sarah's environmental angle. My property contained a natural spring that fed into state-protected wetlands 2 miles downstream. The EPA investigation had revealed contamination in the endangered salamander habitat that triggered automatic federal involvement. "Rex, this isn't just about your fish anymore," Agent Torres explained during our next meeting at the same greasy diner. "We've found methylene chloride in Spring Creek, which feeds the Clearwater Wildlife Preserve. You may have prevented an ecological disaster that could have killed off an entire protected species." The power dynamic had completely shifted. What started as a petty HOA dispute was now a federal environmental crime investigation with potential ties to endangered species protection. Constance's husband, the hotshot attorney, knew about the embezzlement and had helped cover it up through legal maneuvering and intimidation tactics. "Here's what we think happened," Agent Torres said, spreading photos across the sticky table. "Mrs. Fitzgerald started skimming HOA funds in small amounts. When the reserve fund got low, she couldn't afford legitimate waste disposal. Rather than stop stealing or replace the money, she chose to dump chemicals illegally. The environmental contamination wasn't some accident or cost-cutting measure. It was the direct result of systematic embezzlement. Constance had literally poisoned the ecosystem to hide her theft. Sarah's investigation had attracted attention from other media outlets. The local TV news picked up the story, and suddenly Constance's social circle was distancing themselves faster than you could say criminal conspiracy. Her tennis partners stopped returning calls. The country club started asking pointed questions about her membership dues. Most importantly, the HOA's insurance company had frozen coverage pending the criminal investigation. Any legal settlements or judgments would come out of the association's assets, which meant homeowners were about to discover their dues had been funding both embezzlement and environmental crimes. "The beautiful thing about federal environmental crimes," Agent Torres explained, "is that they carry heavier penalties than traditional white-collar theft. Mrs. Fitzgerald is looking at potential decades in prison, not years." I realized I wasn't fighting a simple property dispute anymore. I'd blown open a complex criminal enterprise that had been operating under the cover of suburban respectability. Constance hadn't just made an enemy. She'd made a federal witness whose testimony could send her away for the rest of her natural life. The machinist who just wanted to fish in peace had accidentally become the key to taking down organized suburban corruption. And honestly, I was starting to enjoy the fight. The war room was my kitchen table, covered with legal documents, environmental reports, and enough coffee cups to caffeinate a small army. Agent Torres had become a regular visitor, along with Sarah Chen and my new attorney, an environmental lawyer named Patricia Hendricks who'd offered to work pro bono after seeing the news coverage. "Rex, you've stumbled into the kind of case that defines careers," Patricia said, adjusting her reading glasses as she reviewed EPA documentation. "Federal prosecutors are building charges that could put Constance away for 45 years, but we need to coordinate our civil case carefully." The strategy was multi-pronged, like a military operation designed by people who actually knew what they were doing. Agent Torres was leading the federal criminal investigation, building RICO charges for organized criminal activity. Sarah was expanding her investigative series to expose systemic HOA corruption across the county. Patricia was preparing a civil lawsuit for property damage, emotional distress, and civil rights violations. And me? I was learning to be the kind of witness that prosecutors dream about: methodical, documented, and mad as hell. Murphy, my retired EPA consultant, had agreed to testify as an expert witness. Over beer and pretzels at his cabin, he walked me through the technical aspects of environmental crime prosecution. "Son, most folks don't realize that environmental violations carry heavier penalties than armed robbery," he said, sketching diagrams on napkins. "Clean Water Act violations can run $50,000 per day, per incident. Your lake contamination lasted at least 6 months, with multiple chemical dumps. We're talking millions in potential fines." Meanwhile, I was teaching myself, and anyone who'd listen, how ordinary people could fight back against HOA corruption. I'd created a simple checklist based on my experience. Document everything with timestamps, research your state's HOA disclosure laws, know that financial records are usually public documents, and understand that environmental violations are federal crimes regardless of local politics. The knowledge I'd gained through trial and error could save other homeowners years of frustration. For instance, I'd learned that citizens could file EPA complaints online in about 15 minutes, and that environmental agencies were required to investigate any complaint involving protected waterways or endangered species. Most people had no idea these tools existed. Patricia explained how HOA board members could be held personally liable for crimes committed with association funds, something that would have been useful to know 18 months ago. When board members use HOA resources for personal gain or criminal activity, they lose the protection of corporate immunity, she said. Constance is personally responsible for every dollar of environmental damage. The community support was overwhelming. Dolores had organized 6 other elderly residents who were tired of Constance's bullying. They'd formed an informal reform group, sharing stories of harassment and intimidation that went back years. My viral GoFundMe had attracted attention from a local environmental group that wanted to use my case to establish a salamander preserve on the contaminated wetlands. "Rex, honey, you've given us permission to fight back," Dolores said during one of our strategy sessions. "That woman has terrorized this community for years, but nobody thought they could take on the HOA legal machine." County Commissioner Janet Walsh called me privately to express support. "I've been waiting for someone with standing to challenge Willowbrook's practices," she admitted. "We've had complaints for years, but nobody would file formal charges. Your federal case gives us cover to investigate other HOAs." Sarah's investigation had uncovered similar patterns at 3 other associations in the county. Inflated contracts, suspicious vendor relationships, environmental violations covered up by intimidation tactics. My case was becoming the tip of a very large iceberg of suburban corruption. The reform strategy for Willowbrook itself was elegant in its simplicity. With Constance facing federal charges, 3 board members had already resigned rather than risk prosecution. The remaining homeowners were organizing to elect a reform slate focused on transparency and actual community service rather than petty authoritarianism. Agent Torres briefed me on how federal prosecutors planned to present the case. "Your documentation is extraordinary, Rex. Most environmental crime cases rely on after-the-fact evidence. You have real-time footage, contamination samples, and a paper trail showing premeditation and cover-up attempts." The timeline was accelerating. Federal grand jury hearings were scheduled for next month. Sarah's investigative series would launch the week before to maximize public pressure. My civil lawsuit would be filed immediately after criminal charges to take advantage of media attention and public outrage. But the most satisfying part was watching Constance's carefully constructed world crumble. Her husband had filed for legal separation and moved assets offshore. The country club had quietly suspended her membership. Former allies were lawyering up and distancing themselves from the investigation. I'd gone from retirement fishing to federal witness in 6 months. Not exactly the quiet life I'd planned, but sometimes the most important battles choose you rather than the other way around. Constance's desperation hit a new low when her husband showed up at my door on a rainy Tuesday evening, briefcase in hand and sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool weather. Richard Fitzgerald looked like a man who'd been losing sleep and gaining ulcers in equal measure. "Rex, we need to talk." His voice carried the forced calm of someone trying not to panic. "Perhaps we can resolve this misunderstanding without further complications." I invited him in, mostly because I was curious how far they'd sink. Richard sat on my couch like it might give him a disease, glancing around my modest cabin with the kind of look rich people reserve for public restrooms. "What Constance did was unfortunate," he began, opening his briefcase with theatrical precision. "But surely we can reach an accommodation that serves everyone's interests." That's when he laid $75,000 in cash on my coffee table. Actual bills, bundled with bank straps, like something out of a mob movie. The smell of money mixed with his expensive cologne and nervous sweat created an oddly compelling cocktail of corruption. "This covers your property damage, legal expenses, and compensates you for the inconvenience," he said, trying to sound like he was doing me a favor. "All we ask is that you withdraw your EPA complaint and sign a confidentiality agreement." I'd been expecting something like this, which is why I had my phone recording in my shirt pocket. The irony was beautiful. Richard was committing felony bribery to cover up his wife's environmental crimes, while I was documenting every word for federal prosecutors. "That's generous, Richard, but I'm not really interested in salamanders for the money." "Salamanders?" He looked genuinely confused, which told me everything about how little he understood the federal case building against his wife. "The endangered species your wife's chemical dumping threatened makes this a federal environmental crime with mandatory minimum sentences." I leaned back in my chair, enjoying his growing discomfort. "You might want to Google Clean Water Act penalties when you get home." Meanwhile, Constance was launching a smear campaign that would have made a political operative proud. She'd hired her niece, a social media consultant, to spread rumors about my mental stability and military service record across local Facebook groups and neighborhood apps. The posts were subtle at first, concerned neighbor wondering about that man's erratic behavior, and troubling signs of instability. But they escalated to outright lies about my discharge from the Army and claims that I'd been hospitalized for psychiatric issues. The mini-twist came when my old sergeant, Billy Morrison, called me laughing his ass off. Billy ran a veterans support group and had seen the online attacks. "Rex, some lady's been calling around asking questions about your service record, wanted to know if you'd been discharged for mental health issues or violent behavior." Billy's gravelly voice carried 3 decades of dealing with military bureaucracy. "I told her your biggest crime was being too good at fixing broken equipment." But here's where Constance made her fatal mistake. She'd tried to recruit other HOA residents to sign a petition calling me mentally unstable and potentially dangerous. The petition backfired spectacularly when residents learned the truth about chemical dumping and embezzlement. "Rex, honey, that woman came to my door with some nonsense about you being dangerous," my neighbor Mrs. Peterson told me while returning a borrowed rake. "I said the only dangerous thing around here is her criminal behavior. Then I called 3 other people to warn them." The social media campaign was traced back to Constance's niece within days. Sarah Chen's investigation revealed payments from HOA funds to Madison Digital Solutions, another shell company designed to hide the use of association money for personal vendettas. Agent Torres called with news that made my week. "Mr. Crawford, attempting to bribe a federal witness just upgraded Mrs. Fitzgerald's case to RICO territory. We're looking at organized criminal enterprise charges now." The IRS had also launched a parallel investigation after EPA referrals showed unreported income from the embezzlement. Constance was facing federal tax evasion charges on top of environmental crimes, and Richard's bribery attempt had made him a co-conspirator in ongoing criminal activity. While they were busy committing new crimes to cover up old ones, I was quietly coordinating with prosecutors to document every obstruction attempt. Each desperate move just provided more evidence of criminal conspiracy and witness intimidation. The beauty of federal environmental crime investigations is that they have unlimited resources and no political pressure to compromise. Local prosecutors might cut deals with connected defendants, but EPA criminal investigators don't care about country club memberships or legal family connections. Constance had spent years terrorizing people who couldn't fight back, but she'd picked the wrong retired machinist, and now she was learning the difference between local politics and federal prison time. The best part? Every attempt to silence me just dug her hole deeper. Richard's briefcase full of cash was now evidence in a federal bribery case, and the social media attacks were documented witness intimidation. They were playing checkers while federal prosecutors were playing chess, and the endgame was approaching fast. Constance's final act of desperation came 3 days before the scheduled HOA annual meeting. I woke to the acrid smell of fresh chemicals and the sight of another oily slick spreading across my lake like a toxic rainbow. She'd hired a crew to dump more solvents while the federal investigation was still pending, either the most brazen act of obstruction I'd ever seen or evidence that stress had finally snapped her last rational brain cell. My upgraded security system caught everything in crystal clear 4K resolution. 2 men in unmarked coveralls dumping barrels under floodlights at 2 in the morning. The beautiful part? One of them looked directly at my camera and waved, apparently unaware they were documenting their own felony. The hydraulic whine of heavy equipment woke me at dawn. A bulldozer was grinding toward my lake access road, blade down, ready to turn my driveway into a moonscape. I threw on clothes and ran outside, but the operator shut down his engine when he saw me coming. "You Rex Crawford?" He was a thick-set guy with calloused hands and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades operating heavy machinery. "That's me. You mind telling me why you're about to bulldoze my road?" "Lady hired me for emergency maintenance on the access easement." He scratched his head and looked around my obviously private property. "But she never showed me any permits, and this don't look like HOA land to me." "That's because it isn't. This is private property. And that lady doesn't have authority to order emergency maintenance on land she doesn't own." The operator, his name was Jake, shut off his engine and climbed down from the cab. Figured something was fishy. 30 years in this business, and nobody does emergency road work at 6 in the morning without proper paperwork. Lady seemed desperate, offered me double rates to start before sunrise. The mini-twist came when FBI wiretaps revealed Constance planning to flee to Costa Rica. Agent Torres played me the recordings during our next meeting, and hearing Constance's voice discussing non-extradition countries while my lake was being poisoned again made my blood pressure spike. "We need to move fast," she told her husband on a call recorded 2 days earlier. "My passport's current, and I can transfer the offshore accounts from anywhere with internet." "Connie, running makes you look guilty." "I am guilty, Richard, of everything except being smart enough to stop when I should have." The desperation in her recorded voice was almost satisfying. That machinist destroyed everything. 3 years of careful planning ruined by some redneck who wouldn't take a hint. But while Constance was planning her escape, I was coordinating with federal marshals to document her flight risk. Every overseas account transfer, every passport inquiry, every conversation about fleeing prosecution was being monitored and recorded. The setup for the public climax was falling into place like clockwork. The HOA annual meeting was scheduled for Thursday night at the community center, with over 200 residents expected to attend. Sarah Chen's investigative series would launch that morning, timed to maximize impact. Federal agents would be positioned throughout the community for coordinated arrests. Meanwhile, Constance tried one last desperate gambit. She filed a false police report claiming I'd threatened her with a weapon during a chance encounter at the grocery store. According to her statement, I'd approached her in the produce section and made specific threats about making her pay, while brandishing what appeared to be a gun. The problem with her story? The grocery store had security cameras, and I'd been shopping with Dolores at the exact time Constance claimed I was threatening her. The footage showed me helping an 83-year-old woman reach soup cans on a high shelf, while Constance was 3 aisles away buying wine. "Ma'am, your timeline doesn't match the security footage," Officer Martinez explained when he called to follow up. "Mr. Crawford was in the canned goods aisle helping an elderly lady. You were in the liquor section. These things happen during stressful times, but filing false reports is a crime." Behind the scenes, my lake was beginning its natural recovery. EPA's emergency cleanup crew had installed filtration systems and was monitoring water quality daily. The salamander population downstream was stabilizing, and early reports suggested the ecosystem damage might be reversible with proper restoration. Agent Torres called with final coordination details. "Rex, tomorrow night, Constance Fitzgerald will be arrested for violations of the Clean Water Act, embezzlement, witness tampering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit environmental crimes. Maximum sentence is 45 years federal prison." 3 more HOAs in the county had requested voluntary EPA inspections after my story spread. The ripple effects were extending far beyond Willowbrook, and reform-minded residents were organizing in communities across the region. But the most satisfying part was knowing that tomorrow night, in front of the entire community she'd terrorized for years, Constance Fitzgerald would finally face justice. The woman who'd tried to destroy my retirement was about to lose everything she'd built through lies, theft, and intimidation. The machinist was ready for his close-up. The Willowbrook Community Center buzzed with nervous energy Thursday night. Word had spread about Sarah Chen's morning exposé, 4,000 words documenting 3 years of embezzlement, environmental crimes, and systematic intimidation. Residents who'd been quietly suffering under Constance's reign were finally ready to speak up. I arrived at 7 sharp with my legal team, walking past federal agents positioned throughout the parking lot like they were attending a barbecue instead of a criminal takedown. Agent Torres gave me a subtle nod from her sedan parked near the main entrance. Sarah Chen was live tweeting from the back row, laptop open, fingers flying across keys. The room was packed beyond capacity. 180 residents filled every chair, with another 20 standing along the walls. You could smell the tension mixed with coffee and nervous sweat. Constance sat at the head table in a navy blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, trying to run the meeting like nothing had changed. Tonight's agenda includes routine budget approval and discussion of upcoming landscaping projects, she announced, her voice steady but her hands shaking slightly as she shuffled papers. We'll also address recent misinformation that's been circulating about association management. Several residents started murmuring. I caught fragments. "Misinformation my ass," and "Where's our money, Constance?" "Mr. Crawford," she said when I stood during the open comments period, "you're not a Willowbrook resident. This meeting is for homeowners only." "Well, Constance, since your criminal activity contaminated my property and threatened federal wildlife preserves, I figure that makes this my business." I pulled out a folder thick with documentation. "Plus, Agent Torres here thought you might want to see this." The room went dead silent. You could hear the air conditioning humming and someone's nervous cough echoing off the walls. I walked to the front and connected my laptop to the presentation screen. This is infrared footage from October 15th showing HOA maintenance staff dumping industrial solvents into my lake at 2:30 a.m. The video played on the big screen, clear as day. 2 men in coveralls dumping barrels while an HOA truck idled nearby. Several residents gasped. One elderly man in the front row muttered, "Jesus Christ." "Here's the financial audit showing $180,000 embezzled from your reserve fund over 3 years." I clicked to the next slide, showing bank transfers to fake companies. "And here's the EPA lab report confirming methylene chloride and trichloroethylene contamination that killed 47 fish and threatened endangered salamanders." Constance tried to interrupt, her voice cracking. "This man is a federal informant trying to destroy our community with fabricated—" "Ma'am, you're under arrest." Agent Torres stood up from the audience, badge visible, handcuffs ready. Two federal marshals moved toward the head table from opposite sides of the room. The entire community center erupted in shocked whispers and nervous movement. Constance Fitzgerald, you're under arrest for violations of the Clean Water Act, embezzlement of association funds, obstruction of a federal investigation, witness tampering, and conspiracy to commit environmental crimes. Constance bolted, actually tried to run in 3-inch heels across a crowded community center. She made it maybe 10 feet before a federal marshal gently but firmly guided her to the floor. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the suddenly quiet room. "Brex, I just wanted to thank you," Mrs. Peterson called out from the audience, her voice shaking with emotion. "That woman has been terrorizing this neighborhood for years. We knew something was wrong, but we were afraid to speak up." A line of residents formed, each wanting to apologize and share their own Constance horror stories. Fines for holiday decorations, lawsuits over garden choices, harassment over property maintenance that met all legal requirements but offended her aesthetic sensibilities. "I'm not here for revenge," I said, addressing the crowd as Constance was led away in handcuffs, her designer blazer wrinkled and her carefully styled hair disheveled. "I'm here because no one should have to fight corruption alone. Your HOA belongs to you, not to whoever's willing to steal from it." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Standing ovation from 180 people who'd been waiting years for someone to stand up to suburban tyranny. Several people were crying, relief, anger, gratitude all mixed together. Emergency motions flew across the floor. Unanimous vote to fire the management company. Unanimous vote to hire independent auditors. Unanimous vote to pay my legal fees and lake restoration costs from recovered embezzlement funds. Sarah Chen captured Constance's perp walk on video. The woman who'd terrorized an entire community reduced to stumbling across a parking lot in handcuffs while federal agents read her rights. The footage would be playing on local news within the hour. "Ladies and gentlemen," the interim board president announced, "Willowbrook Estates is under new management, our own management." The crowd erupted in applause that could probably be heard 3 blocks away. Justice, it turns out, sounds like 180 people cheering at the same time. 6 months later, Constance Fitzgerald was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $2.3 million in restitution. The judge called it one of the most egregious cases of environmental crime motivated by personal greed he'd seen in 20 years on the bench. Her husband Richard got 3 years for conspiracy and witness tampering. Turns out bribery really is a federal crime, regardless of how expensive your lawyer is. The embezzled funds were recovered through asset forfeiture, Richard's offshore accounts, Constance's jewelry collection, even that spotless white BMW. Every penny went back to the HOA Reserve Fund and environmental restoration. Amazing how much money you can recover when federal prosecutors are motivated and subpoena power is unlimited. My lake came back to life faster than anyone expected. EPA's emergency cleanup removed the contaminated sediment, and within 4 months, fish were jumping again. The water runs so clear now you can see bottom at 12 feet. I caught a 5-pound bass last week that fought like it had something to prove, probably a descendant of the survivors with an attitude about chemical dumping. The environmental group established the Clearwater Salamander Preserve on the adjacent wetlands, using Constance's restitution payments to fund habitat restoration and water quality monitoring. Turns out endangered species protection is expensive, but systematic embezzlement provides excellent funding when the courts get involved. Willowbrook transformed into an actual community. The new board eliminated punitive rules and started focusing on things that matter: neighborhood watch programs, community gardens, annual festivals that bring people together instead of driving them apart. Property values recovered and exceeded pre-scandal levels within 6 months. Funny how removing toxic leadership improves everything around it. I became the unofficial mediator for neighbor disputes, which mostly involves reminding people that reasonable adults can solve problems without lawsuits or harassment campaigns. Common sense, apparently, is a revolutionary concept in suburban governance. The annual Clean Water Festival draws hundreds of families to celebrate environmental protection and community cooperation. This year's proceeds funded college scholarships for working-class kids studying environmental law, the Rex Crawford Environmental Scholarship Program. 15 students received aid in the first year, all attending state universities and planning careers in environmental protection. My speaking engagements at law schools focus on citizen activism and environmental justice. Students love the story of a retired machinist taking down organized suburban corruption with trail cameras and EPA complaints. The message is simple. Ordinary people with documentation and persistence can defeat extraordinary corruption. The documentary Toxic HOA aired on regional television and streaming services, reaching millions of viewers nationwide. My story inspired similar investigations in 12 states, leading to environmental audits and criminal charges against HOA boards from California to Maine. Turns out systematic corruption is a nationwide problem that requires systematic solutions. I married Ellen, Dolores' daughter, who moved back to care for her elderly mother. Ellen's an environmental engineer who thinks my accidental activism is either heroic or insane, depending on her mood. We're building a cabin on the far side of the lake where we can fish in peace and watch the salamanders thrive in their restored habitat. The best part? My phone keeps ringing with calls from people fighting their own HOA corruption. Trailer park residents battling illegal toxic waste dumps. Condo owners discovering embezzled maintenance funds. Homeowners facing harassment from power-hungry board members who forgot they're supposed to serve the community, not rule it. Rex, there's a lady in Tennessee whose HOA is dumping paint thinner in a creek, Ellen said last week, handing me the phone. Says she read about your case and wants advice. Maybe I found my calling in retirement after all. Fighting corruption wasn't exactly what I planned for my golden years, but sometimes the most important work chooses you instead of the other way around. The lake sparkles in the afternoon sun, bass jumping like they're celebrating their own survival. Loons call across water so clear you can watch salamanders swimming 8 feet down. This is what victory looks like. An ecosystem restored, a community healed, and justice served with a side of environmental protection. Share your worst HOA nightmare in the comments below. I read every single one, and your story might be the next federal case waiting to happen. Hit subscribe if you want to see more little guys taking down corrupt systems, because this is just the beginning. Where are you watching from? I'm building a community of people who refuse to back down.
That's a wrap for today's episode on HOA Stories. If you enjoyed watching Karma in action, smash that like button, comment your thoughts, and let us know if you've dealt with HOA madness too. Subscribe so you won't miss the next HOA meltdown we post.